noite. Responsabilidade social, trabalho voluntário, filantropia, solidariedade e ajuda. Não há bem-estar social possível sem que a própria sociedade arregace as mangas e trabalhe em busca desse bem-estar. A desigualdade provocada pelo mercado e a ação social insuficiente dos governos têm levado um número cada vez maior de pessoas e empresas a trabalhar em favor da coletividade, do bem comum. Esse é o trabalho do terceiro setor, tema do Roda Viva desta noite, que para isso traz um convidado especial. Salamon, diretor do Centro de Estudos sobre Sociedade Civil da Universidade John Hopkins, nos Estados Unidos. O professor Salamon coordena um estudo internacional sobre o terceiro setor, também chamado de setor sem fins lucrativos. É um estudo sobre a atuação das também chamadas organizações não governamentais, que são entidades, associações, cooperativas, fundações privadas, movimentos sociais organizados, muitos deles incorporando o trabalho voluntário e todos buscando soluções para problemas coletivos, problemas da sociedade, do meio ambiente, da economia, ou seja, buscando resolver problemas que o Estado já não consegue mais solucionar sozinho. Para entrevistar Salamon e discutir a economia social, nós convidamos Sérgio Amoroso, presidente do Grupo Orsa e instituidor da Fundação Orsa. Gilberto Nascimento, colunista do jornal Diário de São Paulo. Claudio Abramo, secretário-geral da organização não governamental Transparência Brasil. Rebeca Raposo, diretora-executiva do Gife, Grupo de Institutos, Fundações e Empresas. Francisco Ornelas, coordenador do curso intensivo de jornalismo aplicado do jornal O Estado de São Paulo. Ricardo Voltolini, consultor de terceiro setor do Serviço Nacional de Aprendizagem Comercial, o SENAC. Daniel Bramati, editor adjunto de cotidiano do jornal Folha de São Paulo. O Roda Viva é transmitido em rede nacional para todos os estados brasileiros e também para Brasília. Infelizmente, este programa não permite a participação do telespectador, porque está sendo gravado, já que terá que ser posteriormente traduzido para o português as respostas do professor Lester. Boa noite, professor.
Good evening.
Aqui no Brasil, quando a gente fala em organização não governamental, eu tenho a impressão que para muita gente a imagem que vem à cabeça é a imagem, por exemplo, do Greenpeace, aqueles ativistas montados num poderoso barco inflável que lutam para preservar a vida das baleias, atacam petroleiros, etc. e tal. O senhor fez um estudo que estabelece 4 características para que uma entidade, uma instituição seja classificada como do terceiro setor. Ela tem que ser organizada, tem que ser privada, ou seja, localizada fora do aparato do governo, não distribuir lucro e ser autogovernada de alguma maneira. E, finalmente, tem ainda a quinta, ter algum grau de participação voluntária, mesmo que apenas no conselho diretor. Então, eu queria começar pelo princípio, porque, apesar dessas definições, existe uma porção de coisas, de instituições e de organizações que parecem terceiro setor, quer dizer, parecem não ser nem o governo nem o mercado e, na verdade, são uma coisa difícil de compreender. E eu cito apenas um exemplo que os brasileiros conhecem muito bem. Existem várias organizações religiosas no Brasil cujo objetivo central é ganhar dinheiro.
Well, I think that the key question in defining these organizations is the fact that they don't distribute their profits to the owners of the organizations. And if you have a set of organizations that seem to be nonprofits and are distributing the money to the owners, we would not consider them legitimately nonprofit organizations. Many countries have developed laws and have developed regulatory provisions that try to separate out the ones that truly are serving public purposes from the ones that are not. It is obviously a serious problem in this field, and in most countries, many countries, there are self-regulatory mechanisms that have been put in place to avoid abuse. But in this field, as in many others, it's important not to let the few cases of abuse, cloud our view of the much bigger reality. This is true in the business sector, in the government sector, and I think so too in this third sector. The vast majority of organizations, I'm convinced, are legitimately non-profit making institutions that are serving their purpose, their public purpose, and I think we should focus on them to the extent that we can.
Outro tema que o senhor aborda frequentemente é o fato de que, no seu ponto de vista, não há uma oposição sistemática e radical entre a ação governamental e a ação do terceiro setor. Tanto assim que praticamente 1/3 dos recursos que nos Estados Unidos são geridos e são utilizados pelo terceiro setor vêm efetivamente da ação governamental. Não é também o caso do Brasil, onde essa participação dos recursos governamentais no terceiro setor é muito menor. Quer dizer, o senhor pensa realmente que é possível haver uma conjugação de esforços sem arestas entre esses dois setores?
Absolutely. There is a very strong record of cooperation between third sector institutions and the government. This is even more pronounced in Western Europe, where there's a very strong partnership that has formed between third sector organizations and government. Basically, governments have certain strengths and they have certain weaknesses. They are very good at generating revenues and passing laws, but they haven't proved that effective in actually delivering services, particularly human services, the services that touch people. And to do that, it's necessary to have a different kind of institution on a smaller scale, a human scale, that can deliver assistance in a more respectful way. And what we have found in our country, and I think the Western Europeans have found in their countries, is that this is a good combination to use the resources of the state, but not necessarily the bureaucracy of the state, to deliver health services and daycare services and assistance to AIDS victims. And so it is surprising to many people that the American nonprofit organizations get 3 times more of their revenue from government than they do from all of the sources of private philanthropy. And that includes individuals, it includes foundations, and it includes corporations. The government has emerged as a major fundraiser for our nonprofit organizations.
Francisco Ornelas.
Professor, o senhor limita as restrições às organizações não governamentais à não obtenção de lucro, à não divisão de lucros entre seus proprietários ou seus instituidores. Mas o senhor não vincula, não limita a obtenção de rendimentos políticos e até políticos partidários da ação da ONG. As ONGs não deveriam ser também organizações apartidárias, apolíticas?
Well, different laws have different countries have different approaches to this. In our own country and in the countries with the UK, the English legal systems, there tends to be a prohibition on political action in the sense of direct campaign activity. In the continental countries, this is not the case. And if you were to go to Sweden, for example, or any of the countries of the Nordic countries, you would find that these organizations are very actively involved in social movements and in political movements. Green parties and labor parties are very much rooted in this third sector. But even in the United States, where direct campaign activity is prohibited, these organizations perform a very important advocacy role. They bring issues to the attention of the governmental authorities. They mobilize people to give attention to problems that are being neglected. And I think this is a very important part of the role that these organizations play in society. They're a kind of social safety net. When problems are being ignored, they exist to mobilize attention to them, to get policymakers and the public at large to be aware of neglected problems. They give voice to the citizen in a way that individual citizens find it very difficult to do. And so I think they keep the democratic system alive and vibrant, very much in the way that the press does. But they provide the vehicle to organize people around issues. So there's a real difference between politics in the sense of campaigning for political office and advocacy in the sense of promoting issues onto the public agenda. And I think the advocacy role of these organizations is protected in most places, and I think is a very important part of their responsibility.
Gilberto.
Eu acho assim que o papel principalmente das ONGs e do terceiro setor talvez seja de identificar problemas, né, fazer diagnóstico da situação e cobrar também providências do governo. Mas eu queria saber a posição do senhor a respeito de uma crítica que se faz muito às ONGs e ao terceiro setor, que é o fato de ela assumir funções ou papel que caberia ao governo. Se o fortalecimento das ONGs, a proliferação desses projetos não pode, de uma certa maneira, fazer o governo deixar de cumprir sua função em variadas áreas. Qual é a posição do senhor assim, sobre essa questão?
Yeah. Well, I feel very strongly that the NGOs, the nonprofit organizations, are not a substitute for the government. This is, I think, one of the big mistakes in the analysis of the third sector. It is the ideological treatment of these organizations. They are frequently put forward as an alternative to the state. And as I indicated in response to Paulo's question earlier, the record, the data do not support this. To the contrary, these organizations have grown the strongest in the areas where they are in partnership with government. And so we have to, in a way, deconstruct what the state is. The state does many different functions. It raises taxes, it generates revenues, it delivers services. There are ways to retain the involvement of the state in the generation of funding and in the identification of rights, rights to health, rights to retirement, without having the state necessarily deliver the services. And this is what I believe is happening around the world, that we are breaking the role of the state in two, and that we are keeping the state engaged in identifying rights and in generating revenues, and then we are turning the job of delivering the services over to a set of institutions that's better equipped to do that. And so I absolutely agree that we should not see the third sector as a substitute, as an alternative to the state. The state must remain involved. And I think one of the really striking features of the third sector in this region and in this country in particular is that it has not that this country has not progressed along that particular route. The state is still not only generating revenue, but is delivering the services. And what is going to be required is a change in thinking, a change in concept, so that we don't see these as either or, but rather we see them as potential partners in public service.
Sérgio.
Dentro ainda dessa questão do papel das ONGs, as Nações Unidas, no que se refere a meio ambiente e erradicação da pobreza, através da Eco 92 e agora no Rio +10 em Joanesburgo, fizeram várias indicações sobre tratados sobre como resolver, como se juntar para enfrentar problemas. O senhor acredita que o terceiro setor, a sociedade civil, possa ter influência ímpar nesse processo para convencer governos que ainda estão relutando em se associar a esse movimento?
I'm not sure if it can have the unique influence, but I think it can play a very significant role. We have seen in the period since the Rio Summit, which was, I think, a very important event in the whole evolution of international relations, the emergence of a third force in the world. Not simply the governments and not simply the international organizations and not simply the multinational corporations, but a force that is represented by cross-national NGOs, nonprofit organizations that make linkages across national borders on particular issues. And the environment is one of the areas where these linkages have been the strongest, very much a product of the 1992 Rio Conference. But it's also happened in other fields, in the fields of human rights, in the fields of anti-corruption. We have Transparency International represented on the panel here today, but in several other fields as well. And there are very interesting developments going on. For one thing, it becomes much more difficult for corporations to hide what they may be doing in a far-off country from their consumers in their home country. And therefore, when a particular company does something that is somehow inappropriate, the consumers back home know about it. And this has, I think, induced companies to think much more carefully about their own social responsibility and to invest in that as an important part of maintaining their reputation. But it's also worked for governments. It's possible for human rights advocates in a particular country to bring human rights abuses to the attention of their colleagues in other countries through these networks, and to put pressure on those other countries and ultimately through the international organizations to get changes in the policies in their own countries. And this is a very powerful force in the international arena. I don't think that it's more powerful than government. I don't think that it's more powerful than multinational corporations. but I think it's a very important and, from my point of view, very positive historical and international force.
Rebeca.
Professor Lessa, eu queria mudar um pouquinho e ir para a pesquisa que o senhor coordenou, a pesquisa comparada entre os 22 países. E a pesquisa já data os resultados dela de 99 e a base de dados, no caso do capítulo brasileiro, era de 95. Depois de sua visita aqui nesse período, e já tendo estado no Brasil anteriormente, como que o senhor vê a posição do terceiro setor brasileiro hoje, de uma visão, de uma maneira crítica, inclusive comparando com os países latinos, nossos vizinhos, que também fizeram parte dessa pesquisa? Como o senhor vê isso hoje?
Well, first of all, I should say that the change over time in Brazil has been quite remarkable, in my view. We still do not have data for the more recent period. We're very eager to update our data, and we have a strategy for doing that and have begun a conversation with IBGE, your statistical agency, with the hope that we will encourage them to adopt a new handbook that we have created in cooperation with the United Nations to enlist national statistical offices to collect this data on a regular basis. I think this is now a very big priority for all of us. But even without these data, I can see the change that has taken place in this country. There is much more acceptance of the concept of a third sector. When we began our work in this country, I think this was not a concept that was accepted. There were NGOs, there were universities, there were hospitals, but the idea that they were part of a common sector was, I think, resisted, both within the sector and by people outside the sector. So there's been a change in thinking in the country. Beyond that, I think there have been some very encouraging developments on the legal front. The 1999 law that was passed here, I think, in my estimation, is a positive step. It's not the end of what must be done, but I think it is a positive step. There is the emergence of a very significant training capacity in this country for third sector organizations. Because if you follow the logic of what I have been saying, these organizations become very important deliverers of the human services that the society decides it needs. And it's therefore important that they be effective. Not only that they have good intentions, but that they be effective at what they do. And this requires training, just as it does in the business sector and just as it does in the government sector. So too we need to professionalize the third sector. And there are very hopeful signs in this country of that developing. And then I think there are interesting developments with regard to partnership. And I think your own organization, Gife, is a good example of that. When I was here the last time, Gife was a baby. It had just been formed. There were questions, would it survive? And I think here we are 6 or 7 years later, and Gife is still in existence. It seems to be thriving, and it is an example of a partnership between the third sector and the business sector. The formation of the Comunidade Solidaria is an evidence of partnership with the public sector. These are all very positive signs. It doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. There is very big work to go, still to do. But I'm fairly encouraged, and I see the energy of the young people in this sector, which is, I think, another very hopeful sign for Brazil.
Claudio.
A minha pergunta tem a ver com a preocupação da minha organização, que é transparência, accountability, essas coisas. E ONGs não são o Estado, elas também não são o setor privado. E tanto o Estado como o setor privado são usualmente sujeitos a critérios, a condições de transparência que ONGs não são. Isso claramente provoca certos problemas, porque não apenas de natureza financeira, certos negócios escusos feitos por ONGs, quer dizer, isso acontece, mas também existe um problema de justificativa mesmo social para a existência de determinadas organizações. É bastante notório que esse é um território de difícil abordagem, tá certo? Como lidar com a transparência das ONGs. E eu pergunto se o senhor tem preocupações nessa direção de entender, de mapear as condições de transparência das ONGs e como o senhor vê a evolução nesse território.
Well, I think it is a concern. It's a very significant concern, and there are various ways that have been taken to deal with this. The question really is, who should be the one to hold these organizations accountable? How should this be done? And there are multiple ways to imagine this. In our country, the principal line of protection is supposed to be the board of directors of the organization, and our laws hold the boards of directors accountable for the operation of the organization. If there are problems, it is the board that's accountable, and if the board is negligent in its duties, it is vulnerable to being sued, and the suits are pursued by our attorney generals in the different states. And so we do have laws in our system that are designed to protect the public against fraudulent action on the part of the nonprofit organizations. What has to be done is to find the right balance between private accountability and public accountability. If the state takes too heavy a hand in enforcing accountability, then the danger will be that the sector will lose its autonomy and its independence. If the state takes too hands-off a posture, there are dangers on the other side. And so what countries have done is to put a minimum set of transparency requirements in their law. We in the United States, as you may know, have a requirement that every nonprofit organization file something equivalent to a tax form every year with our Internal Revenue Service. These forms are open to the public. There's now an organization in our country that takes these forms, translates them into electronic form, and makes them available on the World Wide Web so that you can look up in the web and find the tax form of any nonprofit organization you want. And it will record all of the finances. It will even record the salaries of the top 5 executives in the organization. And this is all an attempt to ensure a degree of transparency in these organizations. Beyond that, various countries have developed codes of ethics for these organizations that stipulate certain reporting requirements. And again, they vary quite considerably, but there is clearly a movement around the world to provide protections. Ultimately, the success of these organizations depends on the public trust. If there is no public trust in them, people will not contribute voluntarily, will not make time available voluntarily. And so these organizations have a big stake in making sure that the public trusts them. And they need to develop their own procedures, and they need to provide sufficient information to make the public's trust preserved. So there is a problem, and various attempts have been made to deal with that problem.
O senhor esteve aqui há 6 anos e agora nessa sua mais recente visita, o senhor deve ter observado as organizações aqui no Brasil. Em 96, o senhor escreveu um artigo bastante famoso aqui no Brasil, em que propunha que as organizações de terceiro setor enfrentariam ao longo dos próximos 10, 15 anos 4 grandes desafios. Eu queria que o senhor tentasse dizer para a gente o que o senhor observou em termos de evolução nas organizações brasileiras em relação a 2 desafios, o da eficácia e o da sustentabilidade.
Well, in a way, I talked to the efficacy one before. It really is a question of how to improve the operation of these organizations. The 4 challenges for those who have had the misfortune of not reading the article are legitimacy, effectiveness, sustainability, and partnership. And in a recent speech that I gave Campus de Jordan a week ago, I added a 5th, which is the theme of justice and social purpose. But so far as the effectiveness is concerned, what I think is required is a recognition that these organizations require more than good intentions, that they need to operate in an effective fashion. And this is a realization that I think has occurred all throughout the world. In a way, you can think of the status of the training of nonprofit organizations today as very much like the status of business administration 50 or 60 years ago. It used to be the case that people came into positions of leadership in major corporations through careers in engineering. They then found themselves running very complex organizations, and they simply weren't prepared. for the financial requirements and the management requirements that came out of that kind of role. And out of that realization emerged the degree of business administration, MBA, the Masters of Business Administration. It is a relatively new degree. So today we're in a similar situation with the nonprofit sector. People have come into those roles because they were social workers or educators or doctors or lawyers. They begin to create organizations. Those organizations grow. Suddenly they're managing very complex organizations with multiple stakeholders and multiple sources of funding. The financial management is an issue, and they simply aren't trained for that. And out of that has arisen a need for a particular kind of management training, specifically targeted for nonprofit organizations. And so in the last decade in the United States, we have developed a very vigorous set of programs of training. My sense is that Brazil is not far behind. Through the work of the Kellogg Foundation, for example, many of the techniques that have been developed both in our country and in other countries have been brought into Brazil. And beyond the university-based training, there are now other institutions. Sinaki is one that has emerged and has formed cooperative relations with us to extend to the third sector good, solid training in strategic planning and marketing, etc. So I think we're moving, you're moving in Brazil along this path. Sustainability is more difficult. My sense is that there is still a pretty significant crisis in the third sector so far as sustainability is concerned. We have in the United States gone through a revolution in the financing of third sector organizations, a technological revolution. The technology of financing these organizations has really been transformed in the last 15 years. Both the private sector funding, the philanthropic funding, and the commercial funding, and the government funding. In all three arenas, there have been major changes. Governments have moved from providing producer-side subsidies to providing consumer-side subsidies. Nonprofits have had to learn how to do a different kind of funding with regard to the public sector. But beyond that, the charitable world has gone through a very significant revolution. We have donor-advised funds. We have for-profit companies that are engaged in creating philanthropic funds, very sophisticated techniques of fundraising. And then there has been a transformation with regard to commercial income. Nonprofits are creating various kinds of ventures. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Guggenheim, these have major marketing operations. In fact, Guggenheim is operating overseas, and so we have the first international nonprofit museum brand. They're out marketing reproductions of works of art in a very sophisticated way. And then there are other kinds of partnerships, cause-related marketing. So what am I saying? The rest of the world is going through a very significant transformation of funding. Some of that is evident in Brazil. My concern is that the Brazilian agencies are not grabbing onto this as thoroughly and as completely as I think they should.
Professor Salamon, nós vamos fazer rápido intervalo e Roda Viva volta daqui a instantes. Até já. Com Roda Viva, esta noite entrevistando Lester Salamon, diretor do Centro de Estudos sobre a Sociedade Civil da Universidade Johns Hopkins, nos Estados Unidos. Ele é um estudioso do terceiro setor, essa área onde atuam empresas e grupos que desenvolvem trabalhos comunitários ligados à promoção social, enfim. É uma definição um pouco mais complicada do que essa que eu estou dando, é justamente esse um dos temas do programa. Como o programa está sendo gravado, ele não permite a participação dos telespectadores. Professor Lester, tem uma peculiaridade dos países subdesenvolvidos que, na minha ignorância aqui, me parece complicar a ação do terceiro setor. Que é a seguinte, aqui, como diz uma expressão popular, o cobertor é curto, ou seja, os recursos do governo são insuficientes para se universalizar uma série de serviços e garantias e direitos que nos países desenvolvidos estão universalizados. Então, se existe um determinado segmento da sociedade organizado para lutar pelos seus interesses, esse segmento pode conquistar mais espaço no orçamento escasso do governo. Eu cito um exemplo claro de uma organização do terceiro setor que não tem essa característica, que é o Movimento Sem Terra, cuja pressão fez com que conseguisse um avanço significativo por parte da ação na reforma agrária. No entanto, a decisão final é a decisão do governo. É ele que diz, ok, vamos dar dinheiro para o Sem Terra e não vamos dar dinheiro para a construção de casas populares ou para conserto das rodovias. Né? Na medida em que esse avanço do terceiro setor se estabelece e que entram aí recursos e organizações que não têm essa base no governo, não se corre o risco de se multiplicarem algumas injustiças em que certos segmentos que uma determinada grande empresa, por exemplo, ache valioso beneficiar, sejam melhor atendidos do que outros segmentos que as empresas não olham. E pior do que isso, nessa seleção por parte do mercado, né, que cria suas organizações, não tem um viés de dizer, ok, vamos fazer uma grande exposição de arte com um pintor mundialmente famoso através da nossa fundação, que é uma fundação sem fins lucrativos, porque isso dá muito mais retorno institucional do que efetivamente trabalhar, por exemplo, na questão da reforma agrária.
Well, to the contrary, I think that the third sector is the best hope we have of pursuing justice. Without the third sector, the landless movement would not exist. You would have individuals attempting on their own to acquire land, and this could be easily stopped. The only hope, I think, of bringing this kind of injustice to the attention of the government is to encourage the creation of exactly these kinds of organizations. Now, to be sure, everyone will not be equally effective and strong, but it's only in giving people the opportunity to organize, to come together, to express their concerns that you will ever produce changes in government policy. Without the third sector, the other sources of power will prevail, and those other sources of power are financial, generally. This is the one vehicle through which the power of the people can really be organized and can be brought to bear in the political realm. So I see them as a very critical part of the production of justice in a country. And keeping that channel open is, I think, one of the best protections for the promotion of social justice that we have.
Daniel.
Professor, dos braços do terceiro setor é o setor filantrópico. No Brasil, a gente ouve muito a ideia de que os ricos são menos solidários do que os pobres. O senhor, na sua pesquisa, é possível ter uma percepção da diferença da cultura da filantropia nos países ricos e nos países pobres?
Well, I think that the culture of philanthropy is a learned culture. There are many traditions that have a culture of philanthropy, and I think Brazil in its history has many examples of a rich culture of philanthropy reaching back into its religious tradition. But that culture has not been reinforced as heavily as it could be in the history of the country. And I think what is encouraging about what's happening through the third sector and through the work of Gife and other organizations is a very concerted effort to remind people of the traditions of philanthropy that exist in this culture. And those traditions need to be thought of in a broad way. They need to be thought of not so simply in a paternalistic way. I think one of the characteristics of philanthropy in this region is that it has had a very heavy paternalistic quality to it. And what I think the emergence of the newer non-governmental organizations has done is to create a different philosophy of what the nature of philanthropy is, one that emphasizes empowerment and not simply the giving of resources from those with them to those without them. And we see the beginnings of this very strongly in Brazil, this sense of mutuality and interdependence. It is, I think, a product of the globalization that's affecting corporations, this realization that the corporations require a good reputation in order to operate, and they can't get that without the involvement in the community in ways that really produce change. So I think there is a new style of philanthropy that is emerging that is very encouraging. There is still considerable distance to go, to be sure, but I have seen very definite signs in Brazil of a new style of philanthropic engagement by the wealthy.
Gilberto. O senhor já falou um pouquinho sobre a situação das ONGs aqui no Brasil, mas eu vejo uma diferença muito grande entre as fundações, ONGs americanas, por exemplo, que têm superestrutura, são super profissionais, estão instaladas em prédios luxuosíssimos, com muitos funcionários e tudo mais. Aqui, a gente está caminhando, já existem também várias organizações grandes, super bem estruturadas, muito profissionais, mas a maioria, principalmente pela dificuldade de obtenção de recursos, até a dificuldade de formação, capacitação, trabalham numa situação ainda muito amadora, muito aquém aí das necessidades. Eu queria saber qual a avaliação do senhor desse estágio em que se encontram essas organizações aqui na América Latina de maneira geral. E uma outra coisa que me chama muito, é curioso, fala-se muito também que as ONGs, o terceiro setor pode contribuir muito realmente até para a geração de emprego. Se isso é real, se isso é possível, é um novo mercado de trabalho realmente que já existe, pessoas são formadas e preparadas hoje para trabalhar nessa área, seja na comunicação, no direito também, na área social. Efetivamente, que contribuição o terceiro setor pode dar, inclusive, para emprego, para geração de emprego?
Well, first, so far as your first question is concerned, it is true that in the United States, many nonprofit organizations are very sophisticated organizations, but it's dangerous to exaggerate that. We also have many, many very small, very new organizations that are barely struggling to survive, and I think something on the order of 2/3 of our organizations have been created in the last 20 years, so there's a constant surging of organizations and formation of new organizations. So we are very much feeling that many of our organizations are still desperately in need of this kind of training. And so I think the gap may be less severe than we imagine. Having said that, I think it's the case that maybe 10 or 15% of the Brazilian organizations really have been through effective training, begun to go through effective training, and there are huge numbers of organizations doing very interesting, very good work that will still benefit from having more training. And I think, therefore, that there is a very significant job ahead, which I would encourage not only the private sector, but the public sector also to contribute to. I think there needs to be a very important investment in the training of nonprofit organizations, particularly as they take on new social roles. So far as the employment is concerned, this sector is a major employer, not only of volunteer labor, but of paid labor as well. We've now done work in 35 countries around the world. We've discovered that the sector's workforce is bigger than the workforce of some major industries. It's bigger than textile manufacturing. It's bigger than food manufacturing. It's bigger than the utilities industry. It's bigger than all of transportation and communications. And so these organizations are major employers. And what's more, we found that this is a very dynamic sector. A part of it is because it's part of the service sector. And we know that in economies around the world, the service sector is growing. But even within the service sector, these organizations have been powerful contributors to economic growth. We've done work in our own country, in our own state. We discovered that 1/4 of the jobs that were created in the last 10 years in the state of Maryland, where I live, were in the nonprofit sector, even though these organizations represented only about 8% of the employment to start with. And in the city where I live, almost all of the net job creation was in the nonprofit sector. This includes hospitals, education, culture. And so they are very significant creators of jobs. Beyond that, I think it's important to realize that even the volunteer work can contribute to skills that people can then carry over into the labor force. In fact, that's one of the major motivations that some people have for volunteering, that it gives them skills that they can use in productive and paying jobs. This is also one of the reasons that corporations in our country have supported volunteer programs, because it gives their junior management opportunities to exercise managerial responsibilities as members of boards. And so both in terms of actually employing people and in terms of providing skills, I think these organizations are important economic contributors.
Rebeca.
Professor, eu queria retomar um pouco o ponto da sustentabilidade, mas não do ponto de vista financeiro, trabalhando sustentabilidade como um conceito mais amplo, a sustentabilidade do setor como um todo, sustentabilidade do ponto de vista da legitimidade também. Eu imagino que isso não seja possível fazer sem a interlocução com o primeiro e o segundo setores, porque o terceiro setor não pode existir isoladamente, imagino eu. Como o senhor pode imaginar um modelo de sustentabilidade? Não existe uma receita de bolo, mas que possibilidades o senhor vê de um modelo de sustentabilidade para o setor no Brasil, considerando que ele precisa se relacionar com o primeiro e com o segundo setores, que também têm problemas de transparência, como o Cláudio levantou, né? Então, nem sempre servem também de modelo para esse setor que está aprendendo, não é? Como é que essa interlocução pode ajudar no caminho da construção de um modelo de sustentabilidade e que possibilidades o senhor vê para esse modelo no caso brasileiro, especificamente?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Sustainability is not simply a financial matter. Sustainability is important in human resources as well as financial resources, but it's also important in generating a base of understanding in the population. And ultimately, as I said before, trust is critical for these organizations. There has to be a sense of confidence and understanding on the part of the public, and therefore legitimacy becomes a part of sustainability. And legitimacy itself has many dimensions. There's, first of all, simply the basic information and knowledge. This sector has been the hidden continent on the landscape of our societies. We know it's out there, but we have not had any data on it. We haven't had information on it. It hasn't been studied in the universities. There's no academic discipline that focuses on it. And up until very recently, the press has pretty much ignored it, though I'm happy to see the interest that the Brazilian press is paying to this sector. And so it's been an invisible presence. And when things are invisible, when they're not present, they are out of mind. And when they're out of mind, people assume that they are insignificant and they are illegitimate. And that's really one of the reasons that we undertook our research. We wanted to demonstrate that this is a very significant presence. One easy way to express its contribution is in economic terms. And so we generate data on how many people are employed in this sector and what is its contribution to the GDP. And we discover that even in these terms, which are just a very small way of measuring the contribution, these are huge institutions, a huge presence in societies around the world. We identified some 40 million employees in nonprofit organizations. 23 million of those are paid employees. And as I indicated before, this makes this sector a bigger employer than some major industries, utilities, food manufacturing, textile, transport. These are huge major industries, and yet the nonprofit organizations employ more people than any of these industries. This is part of building the legitimacy of the sector, demonstrating that it is a significant social player.
Francisco.
Professor, eu gostaria de trilhar um caminho agora no rumo da responsabilidade social das empresas mercantilistas e sair um pouco das ONGs como instituições da sociedade. O senhor fala nos seus estudos, nos seus trabalhos, seguidas vezes na responsabilidade social da empresa. A responsabilidade é um conceito passível de ser metodizado, passível de ser codificado, como a ética. Mas a responsabilidade social de uma empresa não depende da cultura, da consciência social dessa empresa. De nada adiantará um compromisso de responsabilidade se não houver uma consciência social. Eu dou-lhe um exemplo. Eu conduzo já há mais de 10 anos, uma das mais antigas empresas de comunicação desse país, uma empresa que tem 127 anos de existência, um programa de treinamento de jornalistas. Programa gratuito, mantido pela empresa junto com parceiros. Há alguns anos houve um debate para se situar este programa dentro da empresa E uma questão que se levantou dentro da empresa foi a seguinte: nós estamos treinando novos jornalistas para nós ou para a concorrência? E a empresa, consciente da sua responsabilidade social, decidiu que está treinando profissionais. Se eles ficarão conosco ou com concorrência, dependerá da competência da empresa em reter os melhores profissionais. Isso é uma consciência social que conduz a metodologia e a conceituação da responsabilidade social. Mas a responsabilidade social, ela não tende a se transformar numa arma institucional de marketing, se não houver esta consciência social?
Well, this is a complicated term, social responsibility. I think the heart of the question, the heart of the matter, is the existence of interdependence in the world. And social responsibility, I think, grows out of the growing interdependence between companies and social institutions more generally. We're living in a world in which companies find it very increasingly difficult to pursue their own objectives without partners, without reaching out to other social actors, without engaging the society of which they're a part. And I think just as your company is training journalists because there is a need for journalists, and without a steady flow of qualified journalists, they can't do your business, so too companies are finding that they need other kinds of qualities in the society without which they can't function. And it's this realization of interdependence that I think is the source of social responsibility. I'm not sure that I would use that term in the ideal world because it seems to imply that the company doesn't get anything out of it. And I think the real success of social responsibility is the understanding not only of what the company gives, but also what the company legitimately receives. And I think any of these partnerships that emerge have to begin with the question, not what do I get out of it, but what does my partner get out of it? And I think increasingly companies are coming to realize that they have very important stakes in the improvement of their reputation, in their ability to retain their customers, in their ability to retain their own staff that comes out of this involvement in social action, social activities.
Professor, é inegável hoje no Brasil o interesse dos jovens por atuar no terceiro setor. É um fato concreto. Há 10 anos, um estudante de administração típico, o sonho profissional dele era pertencer ao quadro de profissionais de uma grande empresa multinacional. E hoje, a cada grupo de 10, 3 ou 4 se interessam por atividades no terceiro setor, que é visto como um campo onde você pode trabalhar e trabalhar em organizações que dão significado para a sua vida, que tornam a sua vida mais interessante e mais agradável. Também a gente observa um outro movimento. As universidades não estão preparando devidamente esses profissionais. Me parece que para atuar numa organização de terceiro setor é preciso um conjunto de competências bastante diferente das competências que se exige numa empresa multinacional. Qual é o papel da universidade nesse processo? O que ela tem que ensinar?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right that young people are turning to these organizations. And in a way, these organizations bring together two very powerful ideas. The first is the idea of individual initiative, the idea that people will have the ability to take the initiative to improve their lives. And secondly, the idea of solidarity, the idea that people don't only exist for themselves, that they have meanings beyond their own existence. And it blends these two ideas and creates a unique set of institutions that provide an outlet for individual initiative that has special meaning in contributing to society. So it's a very compelling idea. And I think that both of those impulses are very much present in our lives. We're all increasingly demanding initiative, the ability to take the initiative. We want to go to the bank and get the money quickly, so we use an ATM machine. We don't want to wait in line. And on the other hand, we are searching for meaning. I think the universities have been slow to adjust to this reality. I think the structure of the disciplines in the universities has been an impediment. And we have been working at this for probably 15 years in the United States, and There has been progress, but I must say that the professions in the university are very resistant to change, and people take a long time to surrender old concepts and old bibliographies and move to a new paradigm that acknowledges this field. None of the disciplines has really owns the third sector. The economics profession focuses on the corporation, the political science profession focuses on the state, sociology focuses on the family, and the third sector is an orphan in the university world. But this is slowly changing, and it's not changing sufficiently. Most of the third sector training programs are in somewhat strange places in the universities. They emerge as parts of policy studies curriculums, or they are attached to a business school curriculum. But whether we will have disciplines that are organized around the third sector is a harder question. I think, as in other things, it may be that the market, that is the demand, the student interest, may be what forces action. In Brazil, there are a number of universities that have made very significant strides in incorporating the third sector into the training programs, both degree programs and non-degree programs. So Getúlio Vargas University here in São Paulo, and several other universities that I've encountered around the country either have established these programs or are about to establish these programs. And that's a step, but there are many other steps. Another very interesting development was one that I was involved in, was the creation of a research society called the International Society for Third Sector Research. It's a group of people who are professionally involved in research on the third sector, and there is a chapter of that in Brazil and a group of colleagues who are engaged in research. So it is beginning, but it's by no means completed.
Sérgio.
Professor, falando pouco em desorganização, miséria, distribuição, a gente podia falar pouquinho das corporações. As corporações têm procurado modelos de gestão que possam motivar os seus colaboradores. Nas suas pesquisas, o senhor tem encontrado tendências para que essas corporações sejam motivadas a trabalhar fortemente no terceiro setor, para que elas possam, ao mesmo tempo, com esse trabalho, manter uma forte motivação com os seus colaboradores? E, além desta questão, o senhor entende que essa tendência, se ela é real, ela pode impactar países mais pobres, uma vez que essas corporações, as 20 maiores, por exemplo, são maiores que mais que 50 países ao redor do mundo. O senhor acha que, com essa tendência, nós poderíamos ter uma distribuição adequada, ter algo nessa direção? O senhor tem pesquisado e visto essa tendência?
Well, I think your question is putting its finger on one of those very important interdependencies between the world of corporations and the world of the third sector. Corporations increasingly, as you doubtless know, are relying on workers who don't bring muscle power to their jobs, but who bring brain power to their jobs. We're moving, as you doubtless know, into, and already are in, an information era in which the power of thought becomes the most important skill that workers can bring to their jobs. So there's a different kind of worker, and this kind of worker is increasingly looking for meaning in their jobs and in their lives. And if they see a conflict between their work life and the life that gives them meaning, they will not be happy employees, and they will search for companies in which the two are much more closely aligned. And I think this has been a very important part of the whole development of corporate social responsibility. It is why corporations, is part of the reason why corporations have come to see in social responsibility a good business practice. Not simply because they're helping society, but because they can help their business. They can retain their employees, and they can retain their consumers. And interestingly, one of the things that I've observed is that the techniques of management in the corporate world and in the nonprofit world have begun to merge. And in our training, we have 2 or 3 principles of our training for the third sector. One of them is the point I made before, that the training must move people beyond good intentions. So it's more than good intentions. And this means incorporating classical business management techniques into the operation of nonprofits. But the second principle is more than business management. And the idea there is that the business field has historically had the luxury of having a very clear bottom line and a very clear objective. It was profit. And it was very easy to define what was needed to achieve profit. The third sector is not in that position. Its bottom line is mission. And it's a very different concept that is driving the management and organization of third sector organizations. They have to think about what is the mission of the organization, and the mission goes beyond having a positive bottom line. But what is interesting is how much the concept of mission, which comes out of the nonprofit sector, has come to infuse the management of business corporations, because the pursuit of profit has come to be seen as not sufficient to attract personnel, to attract customers, and so business begins to talk about quality as the goal of the corporation. Not simply profit, but quality, and defining the product in a way that has a certain meaning. And so companies have found it desirable to associate themselves with nonprofit organizations that can lend meaning to their objectives. And so we find, for example, this phenomenon of cause-related marketing, where a company will devote a certain percentage of its proceeds to a nonprofit organization as a way to connect the company and its profit to the purpose that the third sector organization is pursuing. And so in a very interesting way, the nonprofit sector is taking some things from the corporate sector, but the corporate sector is taking some things from the nonprofit sector, and underlying it all, I think, is this reality of interdependence and the needs of both sectors. The third sector needing the corporate sector to give it legitimacy, to give it support, and the business sector in turn needing from the third sector meaning and the special attractiveness that involvement in this kind of social activity brings. And that allows the business to attract personnel and retain them, and I think it helps it attract customers as well.
Professor, vamos fazer mais rápido intervalo e voltamos já já. Retomar o Roda Viva esta noite com Lester Salamon, diretor do Centro de Estudos sobre a Sociedade Civil da Universidade Johns Hopkins, dos Estados Unidos. Ele estuda o terceiro setor e, como o programa está sendo gravado, ele não permite a participação do telespectador. Professor, o senhor apresentou aí um cenário bastante positivo do terceiro setor e me deu a impressão de que não existe um grande problema. Então a pergunta é simples: qual é o grande problema do terceiro setor, se é que existe um? Como, por exemplo, existe, eu acho, no caso dos governos dos nossos países aqui da América Latina, o grande problema talvez seja a dívida que o país tem, né? O grande problema é o subdesenvolvimento. No terceiro setor, há um grande drama?
Well, I think there are many major dramas in the third sector, and when I describe progress, it was against the backdrop of what I was seeing many years ago, and I think there has been progress. But on each of the challenges that I tried to identify, there are significant unfinished business. I don't think yet the concept of a third sector is really well understood in Brazil. I think there's still ideological battles over this, many of which I have heard over the last 3 or 4 days here. Resistance to seeing the existence of a sector, problems of building the infrastructure for the sector. This is, I think, one of the important unfinished businesses here in Brazil. In the business sector, there are vast numbers of organizations that represent all of the different branches of business and the business community as a whole. In the third sector, that has not yet been built. We have a few of them. Gife is one example of them. But for this sector really to become legitimate, it needs to have spokespersons that can speak to the state, that can speak to the business community, that can speak to the population at large, and make this sector understandable. And I think that is a huge gap that still exists. So we have a major problem still of legitimacy of this sector. I think the sustainability that we were talking about before, public awareness, financial support is a huge, huge problem in Brazil. And I think many organizations are struggling or feeling frustrated at their inability to find local sources of support. They've been supported for many years by outside sources, both foundations and international aid agencies. Those sources are drying up. Our own foundation community has been through a real shrinking because of our stock market declines. And so I think there's a real sense of crisis on, in terms of support for these organizations. They've proved that they can accomplish many things, but I think their future really hangs in the balance. And so this is a time for Brazilian society really to step forward and for the government to step forward to really demonstrate the kind of support that these organizations need.
Como é que o senhor vê essa busca das ONGs por poder político e até mais do que isso por poder político global?
Well, I think it's a very positive, important sign. I think it is a new force in the international arena, and I think it will help to bring the voice of the NGO community and the people that they represent onto the international stage. The world is a smaller place than it has ever been before, and more things are internationally interconnected. And it's important that just as corporations have found ways to connect internationally and governments have found ways to connect internationally, so too should the citizen sector, the civil society sector. And I think this is a very positive development that these organizations begin to come together. My hope is that over time we will find forums in which all three sectors can assemble together and work together on these global problems. This is, I think, my general feeling about how we're going to solve major social and economic problems in the years ahead. It's not going to be just the state, and it's not going to be just the market, and it's not going to be just the third sector. It is going to be some combination of all three.
Como o senhor acabou de colocar, já existem aqui no Brasil também, né, claro, grandes empresas que criaram suas fundações, instituições e que discutem problemas sérios no Brasil, como a educação, por exemplo. Além do Gife, nós temos o Instituto Ethos de Responsabilidade Social, que reúne hoje as maiores empresas do Brasil, quase todas as grandes corporações estão afiliadas ao Instituto Ethos. E lá se discute essa questão da responsabilidade social. E um problema que se coloca é de empresas, referente a empresas, que hoje estão desenvolvendo trabalhos sérios, apoiando projetos sérios, mas que no seu dia a dia, lá, um tema que o senhor já falou rapidinho, o Francisco já havia perguntado, mas eu queria falar um pouquinho mais sobre, que o senhor falasse um pouquinho mais sobre isso. O caso, por exemplo, de uma grande construtora que apoia projetos sociais super importantes, mas de repente está ou esteve envolvida em fraudes, em concorrências públicas, em licitações, em denúncias desse tipo. Ou o caso, por exemplo, de uma grande empresa, acho que posso até citar, que produz cigarros, por exemplo, e também desenvolve trabalho, projetos sociais. Como é que esse tipo de problema, por exemplo, nos Estados Unidos, é visto, ou foi visto, ou se resolveu? Eu imagino, claro, que na medida que você exerce um discurso lá da responsabilidade social e exerce uma conduta diferente disso, automaticamente já há uma obrigação de discutir essa questão ou dar uma resposta para a sociedade. Eu já vi o problema colocado, mas eu não vi a resposta ainda. Como é que o senhor vê isso?
Well, this is a very important point, and I think the more the third sector gets involved with the corporate sector, the more this becomes an issue. And there are two ways, I think, at least, to deal with this issue. First of all, the non-profit organization, the civil society organization, has to have its own rules for how it engages with corporations. It needs to be careful, for example, that it's not endorsing products that are not the competent, good products in the field. And we've had several examples of that in the United States where a a prominent nonprofit organization will allow its name to be used in relation to a product, and it turns out that the product is not of the quality that would be suggested by that endorsement. And these organizations, these have become major scandals.
Qual produto?
I'm sorry?
Qual produto?
The product was a chemical product, a medical product, and it was the American Medical Association. I'm not sure I remember the exact product, but it was the AMA, major medical association. And all of the top leadership of that organization had to resign over this issue. There is the question of the product that you're endorsing, and then there is the potential use of this kind of cause-related marketing or partnership as a kind of fig leaf to cover over other things that the corporations are doing that are not as nice. And I think that the organizations at the beginning, the first line of defense, have to be very careful and have to make very clear to the companies that they are only allowing their name to be used under certain conditions. And those conditions have to go beyond the specifics of the narrow partnership to the broader business practices. And therefore you can't partner with an organization, allow your name to be used, and discover that that organization is engaged in labor practices that are inappropriate, that are using child labor, that are polluting the environment. And these have to be the requirements. So that's one line of defense. The other line of defense is your profession, is the press. These relationships need to be treated as legitimate topics for press attention. They need to be open for investigation. They need to be transparent. And the press, I think, is as much an important regulator of these kinds of relationships as it is relationships between corporations and the public sector or any other relationship of this sort. They need to be open to scrutiny. And if that's not the case, then I think they are legitimately suspect. So I absolutely agree to you. This is an area of great potential, but also of great danger. And the only thing at the end of the day that the third sector has is its reputation. And if it squanders its reputation, it will have squandered its major asset. And therefore it has to enter these relationships with great care. And we have, in the United States, developed codes of conduct with regard to cause-related marketing, for example. What are the criteria that should be observed when a nonprofit goes into a cause-related marketing relationship? These are just developing because many of these relationships are new, but I think they're absolutely important.
Dando ainda continuidade ao tópico que o Gilberto levantou e outros já levantaram também, eu acho que isso é muito importante no caso brasileiro, porque nós estamos num momento de muita mobilização das corporações em torno dessas causas. Essa interdependência que o senhor mencionou é muito interessante e certamente ela é necessária e pode ser muito rica para a sociedade como um todo, mas ela de fato traz alguns riscos importantes. Um deles se refere ao já mencionado também pelo senhor no início do programa de um marco regulatório favorável para o desenvolvimento do setor. Que riscos o senhor vê e que recomendação o senhor faria, por exemplo, para um governante que precisa reconhecer sociedade civil, entender o terceiro setor e batalhar por incentivos fiscais para um setor que é muito confuso na sua interdependência? Como é que o governo vai reconhecer a legitimidade da concessão de incentivos fiscais para fins públicos e quando é que vai ser para fins privados? Como é que um governante pode reconhecer isso?
Well, I think that the government, first of all, needs to understand the value of these relationships and approach it with an awareness of what it is that the public is getting out of these relationships. And I would expect that they would bring to the assessment of them a tough calculus of profit and loss and gain and benefit and loss. These relationships need, at the end of the day, to deliver something of value to the public. That is ultimately the basis on which tax incentives are given and other incentives and tax advantages are given to the third sector. And so if the relationships don't produce public benefit, then it seems to me that they are appropriately treated in some other way. And it may not be clear on the face of it what the public benefit is. But I think that's the ultimate test. And I'm not sure that it needs to be only the public sector that is the regulator of this. I think the first line of defense has to be the nonprofit organizations. There have to be clear guidelines that are developed within the sector that specify what the gains to the public need to be in order to justify special tax privileges for these relationships. And I would think that organizations like Gife, or Ethos, which are promoting these kinds of relationships, could very usefully develop, if you haven't done so already, very specific codes of ethics. What is expected of the relationship itself that's being developed? What are the public benefits that are coming out of it? Is it worth the grant of the good name of the nonprofit for that purpose? But then beyond that, what are the expectations that ought to be applied to the company's behavior more generally? Not simply with the specifics of this relationship, but with regard to its employment policies, its environmental policies, its social policies. These are all legitimate questions that a nonprofit entering a partnership with the corporation should ask and should be allowed to ask. And so I would hope that there would develop, as there has in our country, codes of ethics governing these relationships, and that spell out pretty clearly what is reasonable to expect.
O que acabou de se discutir aqui, e eu pergunto ao senhor o seguinte: o senhor vê algum problema ético no relacionamento que se estabelece entre uma ONG e uma empresa privada, no qual a empresa privada ganha o direito de usar a marca da ONG, um selo, uma menção qualquer, contra o pagamento de uma mensalidade à ONG? Eu digo isso porque a minha organização é sistematicamente sujeita a ofertas dessa natureza, nós nos recusamos, achamos isso antiético. Porque nós achamos que a motivação mercadológica não é uma motivação que se coadune com a nossa finalidade. O motivo pelo qual uma empresa procura uma ONG para isso é um motivo comercial, certo? Então, é típico, isso apenas como observação, que sempre que isso acontece, nós dizemos, olha, você pode usar isso no seu material institucional. Você pode dizer que nos apoia, se quiser, não tem nenhuma no strings attached, né? Mas não pode usar no seu material comercial. E ninguém quer. Só querem no seu material comercial. Só querem fazer a relação entre a organização e os seus produtos. Nós, e eu pessoalmente, acho que isso é impossível, é uma relação que estabelece um problema ético muito sério e nós não fazemos. Eu pergunto se o senhor acha que existe problema ético aí.
There can be an ethical problem, but I think there are ways to protect against the ethical problem, and we were talking about some of them. We have many examples in the United States of these kinds of partnerships. Increasingly, this is in fact the trend in the relationship between the corporate sector and the nonprofit sector. The partnerships are becoming more intense, more tight, more all-pervasive. The nonprofit and the corporation are forming much broader connections. And these connections have at their root, as I argued before, interdependence. And to expect the company to go into them purely out of altruistic motives is expecting a lot. I don't think that there is a problem in having these relationships produce mutual benefits, benefits to the company and benefits to the third sector. Where the ethical problems arise is where the company is using the relationship with a nonprofit as a cover for other things that it's doing that the nonprofit would not be in support of. That, to me, is an ethical problem. Or where the stipulation of the relationship undermines one of the objectives of the nonprofit. Let me give you an example. There are examples in our country of universities forming relationships with pharmaceutical companies, in which the pharmaceutical company will pay for the research at the university in return for having a lock on any of the discoveries from the research that they finance. To me, that is unethical. And it's unethical because one of the central principles of a university is the free access to knowledge. And if the knowledge does not become open, then the mission of the university is undermined. But it would not bother me if that pharmaceutical company made a grant to my university and asked that they be allowed to advertise that they are supporting research at major universities. What would be unethical to me is where they want to control the results of the research. So there is a gain that the company could get, but it does not, to my mind, trigger an ethical problem.
Bom, mas ainda nesse particular, a pesquisa acadêmica nos Estados Unidos, ela é muito financiada pelo setor privado, seja direta, seja indiretamente, via National Science Foundation. Quer dizer, essa relação entre a pesquisa acadêmica nos Estados Unidos, especificamente, e o financiamento privado contra o controle do que é, enfim, descoberto ou desenvolvido, isso vem assim nos Estados Unidos há décadas. Quer dizer, essa situação existe nos Estados Unidos, não é nova. É assim que a pesquisa é feita lá. Quer dizer, em uma boa parte dos setores. Quer dizer, então, esse problema ético existe, ele sempre existiu. Ele está lá, está presente lá, não é uma novidade.
What's new is the demand to own the results of this research, to own it as for the ability to patent the results of this research. And historically, certainly all of the government research that has been done at universities has not been patentable at all. And just in the last 10 years or 15 years, has it been possible to patent the research. So the ethical problems to me arise where the arrangement, the partnership with the government, or I'm sorry, with the corporation, undermines the basic mission of the nonprofit. And so if a nonprofit, for example, that's promoting abortion, forms a alliance with a company that somehow is opposed to it, and it ceases to make that part of its mission, that is unethical. But if the company is benefiting commercially from its engagement with the third sector, for me, that does not raise an ethical issue.
A impressão que me fica ao longo desse nosso diálogo tão esclarecedor é que eu, enfim, descobri o paraíso. No início deste bloco, respondendo a uma indagação do Paulo Marcum, que lhe perguntou sobre os problemas do terceiro setor, o senhor elencou uma série de problemas criados por instituições externas dentro do terceiro setor. Nenhum dos problemas relacionados pelo senhor foi gerado pelo terceiro setor. Em seguida, a uma questão do Gilberto Nascimento, o senhor se referiu a uma ação de uma empresa, médica, farmacêutica americana, que usava sua atividade social como uma folha de fio. Arremessa a figura de Adão e Eva, impossível de ser evitada. O terceiro setor é o paraíso? Não há pecado nele?
No, it's very difficult to sin on one's own, so it's complicity in these relationships. The third sector has weaknesses, to be sure. I think that I used a metaphor in an earlier discussion in Brazil of the wind. The third sector of Brazil reminds me very much of a wind. The wind is potentially a very destructive force. It moves this way and that way without a lot of direction. It's also potentially a constructive force, and the question of which it is depends on whether it's harnessed and channeled. And from my perspective, the third sector of Brazil is by no means fully channeling the energy that it represents into wholly constructive purposes. And there are great tensions within this sector. There are great rivalries within the sector. There's extensive duplication. There's a sense of self-righteousness that I think is not productive, is harmful. There's a sense of antagonism between this sector and the other sectors. All of these are problems that come out of the history of this sector and that do require to be improved on if the sector is going to function the way I would hope that it would function.
Pecado não há.
I'm not sure what you mean by sins. There certainly is poor performance. There certainly is preoccupation with their own activities. And yes, there probably is corruption and graft in this sector as there are in others.
Ricardo.
Professor, nós falamos muito aqui sobre financiamento de empresas privadas, mas a sua pesquisa mostra que, a pesquisa painel comparativo com 22 países, mostra que o financiamento de empresas não é o principal financiamento das atividades de terceiro setor. Ao contrário do que muita gente imagina, a sua pesquisa mostra um dado interessante. Nos países em que o terceiro setor é mais forte, há mais financiamento dos governos da atividade. Nós estamos aí na iminência de uma mudança de governo. Eu queria que o senhor dissesse como é que, idealmente, um governo tem que se relacionar com organizações de terceiro setor. O senhor imagina, por exemplo, eu queria saber sua opinião sobre se o senhor é ou não favorável a incentivos fiscais, que é uma decisão, tem que ser, evidentemente, tem que mudar a lei para isso, né, e precisa de governo, para investimentos feitos por empresas privadas e por indivíduos em atividades de terceiro setor.
Well, I think there are several things that I would say if I were speaking to the President. First of all, I would change the laws to improve the tax treatment of contributions to these organizations. I think it's legitimate also for the government to impose expectations on these organizations, transparency, to make sure that the resources are used effectively. But beyond that, I would urge the new president to take a different view of the state, not simply of the third sector, but of the state. What is the nature of the state? And I think that in the Brazilian context, the state is still very much thought of in the old industrial model, that the state is vertically structured to produce all of the public goods that it wants to support. This makes it necessary to build the state bureaucracy very substantially. And I think what's happening elsewhere in the world is that we are changing the model. We're using the model of the modern telecommunications companies or the modern production corporations. They're not any longer vertically integrated. They are outsourcing functions. They're building networks. They're reaching across the ocean to perform different functions. And this whole model of how to operate a modern organization has not quite penetrated into the state in Brazil. And I think that needs to change. And when that changes, then the government will begin to see the third sector as a potential partner and a potential entity that it can rely on to carry out these other functions. It will begin to use contracts instead of simply government bureaucrats. It will use grants. It will experiment with loan guarantees. It will do voucher types of programs. In other words, it will reach out to the broader society and it will empower and engage these other institutions and take advantage of their skills, always with good controls to make sure that the public purposes are met. But I think there needs to be a fundamental reform of the whole character of the state as a first step towards then reaching out to the third sector as a partner.
Professor Lester, nosso tempo terminou, mas eu queria fazer uma última pergunta bastante sintética. O terceiro setor é cada dia mais uma coisa importante, complexa, inserida nos mais diversos segmentos e cada dia mais sofisticada. A impressão que eu tenho é que, às vezes, o trabalho voluntário, aquele que a pessoa fazia pura e simplesmente nas suas horas de folga e que, de alguma forma, achava que estava com aquilo contribuindo para a sociedade, não é mais o caminho para o desenvolvimento dessa atividade do terceiro setor. Mas a pergunta que eu queria fazer é se o senhor faz algum tipo de trabalho voluntário.
Absolutely. I do. I'm on several boards. I work with an organization in my own community that is attempting to create a body of resources that will be available for coping with social and economic problems and improving education. It's, of course, always hard to find the time for this kind of work, but I do think it's important. And if I can just add one other point, I don't think it's the case that there is a conflict between the growth and sophistication of this sector and its use of volunteers. To the contrary, all the data that we have suggests that for volunteers to be really useful in these organizations, there has to be a structure for it. They have to be recruited, they have to be given jobs that have meaning, and this requires a certain amount of organizational capacity. So the growth of the sector and the growth of volunteers go hand in hand.
Professor Lester, muito obrigado pela sua entrevista, obrigado aos nossos entrevistadores e a você que está em casa. E nós voltaremos na próxima segunda-feira com mais um Roda Viva. Aliás, uma produção de uma TV que é exatamente do terceiro setor, já que a Fundação Padre Anchieta é uma fundação que tem todas as características desse tipo de setor. Não é mercado, não é governo. Uma boa noite, até segunda que vem.